What if Job, in his suffering, had cursed God and proved Satan right? The hidden narrative. What if the most righteous man who ever lived wasn't strong enough? That's the question no one dares to ask. The question that trembles on the edge of every prayer whispered in darkness. The question that haunts the faithful when suffering strips away everything they thought they knew about divine justice. I am the guardian, the keeper of realities that exist in the shadows between what is and what could have been. And among all the timelines I have witnessed, all the alternate histories that branch like fractured glass from a single moment of choice, there is one reality I have tried to forget. A reality where Job cursed God, where the most faithful man in creation broke under the weight of his suffering, where Satan won the cosmic wager, where faith itself became a question mark etched into the fabric of existence. This is that story, the hidden narrative. The timeline we pretend could never happen, because acknowledging it would mean admitting something terrifying about the nature of human endurance. Let me take you there, to the reality that should not exist. In the beginning, before the fall, Job was perfect. Not in the way we use that word casually, tossing it around like cheap currency. No, Job was perfect in the way a mathematical equation is perfect, in the way a sunrise over untouched wilderness is perfect, complete, whole, unblemished. He lived in the land of Uz, a place where the desert met the sky in an endless horizon of possibility. His tent stretched across the landscape like a small city, 10 children, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, servants beyond counting. But wealth wasn't what made Job remarkable. Plenty of men have accumulated fortunes. Plenty have built empires from dust and determination. What set Job apart was the architecture of his soul. Every morning, before the sun painted the desert gold, Job would rise and offer sacrifices for his children, not because they had sinned, but because they might have. Because in the secret chambers of their hearts, in moments he couldn't witness, they might have entertained thoughts that fell short of righteousness. This was Job's obsession. This was his devotion, the systematic elimination of any possible imperfection in his household, the construction of a moral fortress so complete that not even God could find fault in it. His wife would watch him from the tent entrance, smoke from the altar rising into the pre-dawn darkness. She never said it aloud, but sometimes she wondered if Job's righteousness was devotion or something else, something closer to fear, the desperate need to be beyond reproach because he couldn't bear the thought of divine disappointment. The servants whispered about it sometimes, how Job never laughed without glancing skyward, as if checking for approval, how his generosity toward the poor seemed less like compassion and more like insurance, how his prayers had the quality of legal contracts, each word carefully chosen to establish his standing before the throne of heaven. But whispers are just noise in the desert wind, and Job was blameless. The scripture was clear on that. God himself declared it in the councils of heaven. That should have been enough. That should have ended the story before it began. But then came the day when the angels presented themselves before the Lord, and among them, moving through the celestial assembly like smoke through cracks in a wall, came Satan, the adversary, the accuser, the one who walks to and fro upon the earth, cataloging humanity's failures like a cosmic accountant. God asked him the question that would shatter a universe. Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and turns away from evil. Picture that moment, the angels silent, the throne room holding its breath, and Satan, ancient and terrible, allowing himself a smile. Does Job fear God for nothing? He asked. The words hung in the air like poison. Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. He paused, letting the accusation settle. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. It was a cosmic wager, a bet on the authenticity of human faith. Could devotion survive when all the blessings were stripped away? Could love for God exist independent of reward? God accepted the terms, with one condition. Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. In that moment, in an alternative reality that branches from our own, like lightning splitting a tree, the universe held its breath, because it knew something terrible was coming, something that would test the very foundations of what faith means. The first messenger arrived while Job was calculating his profits, breathless, covered in ash, eyes wide with the kind of horror that rewrites a person from the inside out. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. His voice cracked. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Job's hand froze mid-calculation. The stylus trembled against the clay tablet. But before he could process the words, before the loss could even register, a second messenger stumbled into the tent. The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. Fire of God, not random tragedy, not human cruelty, divine fire. The same fire that consumed sacrifices on altars. The same fire Job had spent his life trying to appease. And I alone have escaped to tell you. A third messenger crashed through the entrance. The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. His face was pale with terror. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Job stood now, his legs unsteady. The tent suddenly too small, too dark, the walls pressing in. 3 catastrophes in the space of minutes. His livelihood erased. His servants murdered. The hedge God had built around him torn down like paper. But he was still standing, still breathing, still faithful. Then came the 4th messenger. And in this alternative reality, in this timeline where everything goes wrong, the messenger's face carried a different kind of devastation. The kind that doesn't just destroy possessions. The kind that reaches into your chest and tears out everything that makes life worth living. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. He could barely get the words out. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people. Silence. And they are dead. 10 children. 10 lives that Job had protected with morning sacrifices and evening prayers. 10 futures that he had carefully constructed. 10 reasons to believe that righteousness mattered. Gone, crushed under stone and timber. Dead while they were laughing and drinking and being young and alive. Job tore his robe. The sound of ripping fabric loud in the sudden silence. He fell to the ground, not in worship, not yet. Just fell because his legs stopped working, because the world had become impossible to navigate. The servants waited, his wife waited, heaven and hell waited, and Job spoke. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. His voice was hollow, empty. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. He paused. The next words cost him everything. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Satan lost the first round. Job held. The cosmic wager seemed settled. But the adversary wasn't finished. He returned to heaven with a new argument, a darker proposition. Skin for skin, he said. All that a man has he will give for his life. His eyes gleamed with ancient malice. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. God gave permission. Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. What followed was suffering of a different order. Not loss from outside, but destruction from within. Painful boils erupted from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, every nerve ending on fire, every breath in agony, his skin cracking and weeping, his body betraying him cell by cell. Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself as he sat among the ashes. The city dump, the place where Uzi threw away everything broken and useless. And that's where Job went, because that's what he had become. His wife found him there, the woman who had watched him pray every morning, who had raised 10 children with him, who had built a life on the foundation of his righteousness. She looked at him sitting in ashes and filth, scraping at his rotting flesh. And she said the words that echo through this alternative reality like a death knell. "Do you still hold fast your integrity?" Her voice was broken glass. Curse God and die. It was an invitation, an escape hatch, a way to end the suffering. Because in this timeline, she had seen something Job hadn't yet acknowledged, that his righteousness was killing him, that his need to be perfect was a prison, that maybe cursing God and dying was better than this slow dissolution into agony. Job looked at her, through eyes swollen with infection, through the fog of constant pain, and he said something that would become famous. "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak." He coughed, blood on his lips. "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" He held, still faithful, still standing in the rubble of his life with his integrity intact. His friends came, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. They sat with him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, because they saw that his suffering was very great. Then they opened their mouths and made it worse. They told him it was his fault, that hidden sin must have brought this judgment, that God doesn't punish the innocent, that if he would just repent of whatever secret evil he had committed, restoration would come. Job defended himself, argued back, maintained his innocence, while his body fell apart piece by piece, while the breaking point approached like a storm on the horizon. And here's what we forget about suffering. Here's what gets sanitized in the retellings. Suffering doesn't stay constant. It escalates. It compounds. It transforms into something beyond physical pain. It becomes existential. It becomes a question mark pressed against the soul until the soul cracks open. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And in this alternative reality, something shifted. Some internal structure that had held Job together began to fracture. The pain didn't decrease. It multiplied. Not just in his body, but in his mind. In the echoing chambers of his memory, where 10 children used to laugh. In the hollow space where faith used to live. The friends kept talking, kept accusing, kept insisting that this was his fault, that somewhere, somehow, he had failed. And Job kept defending, kept arguing, kept trying to maintain the fortress of his righteousness, even as the walls crumbled. But there's only so long a man can stand in the fire before he burns. Only so much suffering a soul can absorb before it overflows. Only so many accusations before the accused starts to believe them. Have you ever wondered what your breaking point is? The question you probably don't want answered. The threshold where everything you believe about yourself proves insufficient. Job reached his, not in a moment of dramatic collapse, but in the slow erosion of hope, in the gradual understanding that this wasn't temporary, that God wasn't coming to fix it, that the suffering had no purpose, no end, no meaning beyond suffering itself. It happened in the darkness of night, in the ash heap, in the space between heartbeats where despair whispers its final offer. He opened his mouth, not to bless, not to maintain integrity, but to release the scream that had been building since the first messenger arrived. "Curse the day I was born." The words fell from his lips like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward, reality itself shuddering. His friends froze. His wife lifted her head. The desert wind stopped. But Job didn't stop there. Because once the dam breaks, once the carefully constructed fortress of righteousness cracks, the flood is unstoppable. "Why did I not die at birth?" His voice was rising now, raw, unfiltered. "Why did the knees receive me? Why did the breasts that I should nurse?" He was screaming at the sky, at the silent heaven, at the God who had allowed this cosmic wager to destroy him. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul? The questions weren't rhetorical anymore. They were accusations. Who long for death, but it comes not, and gig for it more than for hidden treasures? His wife moved closer. The friends backed away. The moment was here, the breaking point. The threshold where faith becomes honesty and honesty becomes curse. Job looked up at the stars, at the sky where God dwelled in unapproachable light, where the cosmic wager was being watched by angels and demons and the adversary himself. He opened his mouth one more time and spoke the words that would rewrite reality. Curse you, God. 3 words, quiet, almost gentle, like the last breath of a dying man. But they echoed through the cosmos like thunder. In heaven, the angels stopped singing. Satan smiled, and God was silent. The cosmic wager was over. The most faithful man in creation had broken, had proven that faith was conditional, that devotion had a price tag, that remove enough blessings, add enough suffering, and even the righteous will turn. Job sat in the ashes, his curse hanging in the air like smoke. His wife collapsed beside him, not in judgment, but in recognition. She had told him to curse God and die. He had finally listened. Now they waited together for the divine retribution that must surely come. But here's the question no one wants to ask, the question that haunts this alternative reality. Was Job wrong to break? Or was he finally, after a lifetime of perfect obedience, being honest? Think about that before we continue, because the answer matters more than you might think. The moment Job cursed God, something broke in the fabric of existence itself. Not with thunder or lightning or dramatic cosmic fanfare. No, the breaking was quieter than that, more terrible in its silence. Heaven went still. The angels who had been watching the cosmic wager unfold stopped their eternal hymns. The seraphim covered their faces. The cherubim turned away, because they had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. The faithful becoming faithless. The righteous choosing rebellion. Satan stood before the throne, and for the first time in his ancient existence, he felt something close to satisfaction. He had proven his point, that human devotion was transactional. That take away the blessings, and you take away the worship. That faith was just another form of economics, and he had finally exposed the price. But satisfaction is a poison that tastes sweet going down, because Satan didn't understand what he had actually accomplished. He thought he had won a debate. He had actually triggered the unraveling of something far more fundamental. In the courts of heaven, God was silent, not the silence of surprise. God doesn't experience surprise, but the silence of grief, the silence of a creator watching his creation choose destruction, the silence of a father watching his child walk into darkness. And the question that reverberated through the celestial realm was this: what now? What happens when the most righteous man proves that righteousness has limits? When the cosmic test case for human faithfulness fails the test, the answer came slowly, like dawn breaking over a battlefield, like understanding arriving too late to change anything. If Job could break, anyone could break. If the most faithful could curse God under sufficient suffering, then faith itself was not the unshakable foundation everyone believed it to be. It was conditional, fragile, dependent on circumstances staying within tolerable boundaries. Back on earth, in the ash heap outside Uz, Job sat in the aftermath of his curse. His wife had collapsed beside him, not in judgment, but in recognition. His friends had fled. Eliphaz whispered prayers of protection as he ran. Bildad covered his head. Zophar didn't look back, because being in proximity to someone who had cursed God was dangerous. Lightning might strike. The earth might open. Divine judgment might fall indiscriminately on the guilty and the nearby. But nothing happened. The sky didn't darken. Fire didn't fall from heaven. God didn't appear in a whirlwind to defend his honor. The silence was worse than judgment, because silence meant absence. Silence meant abandonment. Silence meant that the relationship between heaven and earth had fundamentally changed. Job waited for death. He wanted it, craved it. Death would be release from the pain that still consumed his body. Death would be escape from the guilt that now consumed his soul. Because even in his breaking, even in his moment of ultimate honesty, Job knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But death didn't come. Days passed, then weeks. His body slowly began to heal, not through divine intervention, but through the natural resilience of human flesh. The boils scabbed over. The infections drained. Gradually, painfully, Job's body returned to something resembling functionality. His soul was another matter. That remained broken, shattered beyond repair. Because healing requires hope, and hope requires the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. Job had no such belief. He had cursed God. He had proven Satan right. He had become the answer to the question no one wanted to ask. What if even the most righteous aren't righteous enough? News of what happened spread like plague through the ancient world. Travelers carried the story from Uz to distant cities. Merchants whispered it in marketplaces. Priests debated it in temples. The man who was perfect had fallen. The man who feared God had cursed God. The hedge of protection had been removed, not by divine caprice, but by human choice. And the implications rippled outward like cracks in glass. If Job could break, then righteousness offered no guarantee of protection. If Job could curse God and live, then perhaps divine judgment was less certain than everyone believed. If Job's story could end in curse rather than blessing, then what was the point of faithfulness at all? A generation grew up hearing Job's name not as a model of endurance, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that suffering has limits even for the devoted, that breaking points exist for everyone, that the cosmic wager between God and Satan had been won by darkness. Philosophers in distant lands heard the story and incorporated it into their arguments about the problem of evil. If the gods allow the righteous to suffer until they break, are the gods just? If divine testing can push humans beyond their capacity to endure, is that testing or torture? The Hebrew people, Job's own cultural descendants, wrestled with the story for centuries. Some tried to explain it away. Others saw in it a terrible honesty about the nature of faith. That maybe the sanitized version, where Job never breaks, was the lie. Maybe the truth was darker and more human. Maybe Job's curse was the most authentic prayer he ever prayed. In the timeline we know, the story ends with restoration. God appears in the whirlwind. Job is humbled and healed. His fortunes are doubled. He has new children to replace the ones who died. The narrative arc bends toward redemption. But in this alternative reality, there is no whirlwind, no restoration, no neat theological resolution. Just the long, slow aftermath of a man who broke and a cosmos that witnessed the breaking. Job lived out his remaining years in quiet obscurity. He never recovered his wealth, never rebuilt his household. His wife stayed with him, bound together not by joy, but by shared trauma. They rarely spoke. What was there to say? They had both seen behind the curtain. They both knew that faith had a price tag, and they had discovered exactly what that price was. Sometimes in the darkness before dawn, Job would wake and remember the mornings when he used to offer sacrifices for his children, when he believed that righteousness mattered, when he thought obedience could build a wall between his family and disaster. The memory was a knife that twisted in his chest, not because he had been wrong to try, but because trying hadn't been enough. The cosmic wager was settled. Satan had his victory. The adversary had proven that human faith was conditional, that devotion had boundaries, that push hard enough, and even the most righteous will choose honest curse over dishonest blessing. But Satan's victory felt hollow after a while, Because proving that humans can break doesn't make the breaking beautiful. Winning an argument about the transactional nature of faith doesn't create the genuine relationship that both heaven and earth were hungering for. The adversary had won the battle and lost something more important in the process. He had proven humans were weak, but he hadn't proven they were worthless. And God? In this alternative reality, God remained silent, not in anger, not in disappointment, but in grief. The grief of a creator who had asked too much, who had allowed a test to become torture, who had permitted cosmic curiosity to override paternal protection. The question that haunts this timeline, the question that echoes through the centuries of this alternative reality, is simple and terrible. Was faith ever supposed to be tested to destruction? Was Job's breaking a failure of human endurance, or a failure of divine mercy? There's a paradox buried in this story that most people miss. Job's curse, his final honest cry of agony and accusation, might have been more authentic than all his years of perfect obedience. Because faith that can't express doubt isn't faith. It's performance. Devotion that can't acknowledge pain isn't devotion. It's pretense. Maybe Job's breaking was the moment he finally stopped performing righteousness and started being human. Maybe his curse was the first real prayer he had prayed in years. Not the polished morning sacrifices or the careful words designed to maintain his standing, but the raw, unfiltered scream of a man who had been pushed too far and refused to pretend anymore. In our reality, Job's story ends with him blessed. In this alternative reality, it ends with him broken. But which version tells the truth about what faithfulness costs? Which version acknowledges the genuine limits of human endurance? Which version honors the complexity of relationship between the divine and the desperate? I am the guardian, and I have witnessed both timelines, the one where Job holds and the one where Job breaks. And I will tell you a secret that heaven and hell both know, but rarely speak aloud. The distance between those two realities is thinner than you think. The difference between enduring and breaking isn't some vast chasm of moral superiority. It's circumstantial. It's timing. It's the question of whether suffering stops one moment before the breaking point or one moment after. Every person who suffers walks the same path Job walked. And every person who walks that path wonders in the darkness if they have the strength to hold, if their faith will prove sufficient, if their breaking point is still ahead or already behind them. Job's curse echoes through this alternative reality as a reminder of something both terrible and oddly comforting, that even the most faithful can break, that human endurance has limits, that honesty about suffering might be more valuable than performance of strength, that maybe the point isn't to never break, but to recognize that breaking doesn't make you worthless. This is the hidden narrative, the story we don't tell in sermons, the version where the righteous fall and the cosmic wager is won by darkness, where faith proves conditional and suffering proves too heavy for even the strongest shoulders, where the question "what if" becomes a window into a reality too honest for comfort. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of this alternative timeline is this: in proving Satan right, Job might have revealed a truth more important than victory. That faith built on the foundation of blessing is fragile. That devotion tested to destruction exposes the cruelty of the test. That maybe the God who allows such suffering owes us answers we're not getting. The legacy of this alternative reality is a world more skeptical of easy answers, more honest about the cost of faithfulness, more willing to acknowledge that sometimes curse is more truthful than blessing, more compassionate toward those who break because everyone understands they might be next. If you've ever wondered whether your faith would survive real suffering, you're asking Job's question. If you've ever felt the weight of expectation to perform righteousness when your soul is screaming, you're living Job's tension. If you've ever wanted permission to stop pretending everything is fine when it's not, Job's curse in this alternative reality gives you that permission. The hidden narrative isn't comfortable. It doesn't end with restoration and doubled blessings, but it ends with something possibly more valuable. The acknowledgement that being human means having limits, and reaching those limits doesn't make you faithless. It makes you honest. What story will you tell about your own suffering? The sanitized version where everything works out? Or the honest version where sometimes breaking is the only truthful response to unbearable pain? Your answer reveals more about your faith than any amount of mourning sacrifices ever could. And if this alternative reality taught us anything worth remembering, it's that honesty in the darkness might be the most sacred thing we have to offer. Subscribe to explore more hidden narratives that challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, suffering, and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. We just walked through a reality where even the most faithful can break. Where Job, the man who had everything, lost everything, and in his deepest suffering chose honesty over performance. His curse wasn't weakness. It was humanity reaching its limit. And if you felt that weight, if you've ever wondered where your own breaking point lies, you're not alone in that question. But here's what I want you to consider. What happens when someone doesn't break ... but bends instead? When they compromise not in a moment of pain, but in a moment of opportunity? There's another story I need to share with you. A story about Daniel. Not the Daniel who survived the lion's den in the version we celebrate, but the Daniel who looked at those lions, looked at the king's offer, and made a different choice. Who traded his faith for survival, his integrity for power, his soul for a throne room seat. He didn't curse God in suffering like Job. He denied God in comfort. And the emptiness that followed? It's a different kind of breaking. The kind where you win everything and lose yourself in the process. If Job's story asked what happens when we're pushed too far, Daniel's story asks what happens when we're tempted just enough. I think you need to hear what became of him. Give his story a chance. It might reveal something about the choices we make when no one's watching. The next video is ready.